So yeah, we are starting off with the role in school factors play in terms of affecting our educational experience and educational attainment. Now, to take a start here, we were discussing social class and the class that we had before this, we spoke about how material factors, how cultural factors, they impacted the educational attainment of an individual. However, today we'd discuss social class with link to the interactionist point of view. What we've studied earlier is there are out school factors and there are in school factors that affect the educational attainment of pupils. And when we speak about factors such as our social class, our ethnicity, and gender, we generally refer to them as out school factors. And we refer to them as out school factors because the general understanding is that your school doesn't really determine your social class, your ethnicity, or your gender. However, today, when we speak about the interactionist point of view, according to interactionists, the assumption that the social class you belong to, the gender you belong to, or your ethnicity determining your educational attainment is too deterministic. Or, in other words, there are many other subtle processes that an individual has to go through when they are attending school, right? So we'd be discussing all of this under the heading of in-school factors. And when we speak about in-school factors, our in-school factors have to do with the educational experience that an individual has while attending school. Now, to take this a step further, we bring in concepts of labeling, ability grouping, and pupil subcultures over here. But what we'd focus on today would be in school factors in relation to social class, or in other words, the social class you belong to. How does this affect your day to day educational experience or your day to day school experience? Let me repeat that we'd speak about in school factors with link or in relation to our social class, right? So how is it that your teachers or your school administration is going to treat you based on the social class you belong to? Or is there any cultural difference between the educational is there a cultural difference between the teachers, the school management, the administration, and a child from the working class, right? And if there's a difference, how is it that this difference is impacting that particular child from a working class school experience? So to take a start over here, like I mentioned earlier, wherever you see this tiny little logo, that means this content is not from your Cambridge Indoors book. This is extra material that I'd advise you to read. Now, moving on, these are in school factors that apply to social class, ethnicity, and gender. Now, these are in school factors. What do we mean when we talk about when we're using this word? These we're talking about your labeling, your ability grouping, and your pupil subculture. They're introduced here with a focus on social class and their application to ethnicity and gender explored in later sections. Like I said, today we'd speak about in school factors in relation to the social class you belong to. Now, an important feature that I'd want everyone to keep in mind over here is labeling. Everyone, I'm assuming, would have an idea about what labeling is. Now, when I use the term labeling, we're talking about how the teachers at times directly or indirectly end up labeling students. Now, for instance, if a teacher carries a stereotypical image of how a child is like when they belong to a particular social class, don't you think that is going to affect their educational attainment? Don't you think that is going to affect their educational experience? Educational attainment तो चलो बात की बात है, लेकिन educational experience को वो affect कैसे करता है? This we'd be discussing today. So when we speak about labeling refers to the ways in which teachers classify and stereotype students, which affect their self-perception. Now, the classification, the identification, the categorization, the classification that leads to the stereotypical that ends up being pretty stereotypical, that comes from the teacher, of course. How is it that it is going to affect a student's perception? And if it is affecting a student's perception, this is definitely going to affect a student's educational experience. And if it is affecting a student's educational experience, it is definitely going to impact their educational attainment later. So Doing this again, labeling refers to ways in which teachers classify and stereotype students, which affect students' self perception. According to Padfield, for example, explores how informal reputations, such as being labeled as a swot or a naughty child, impacted the educational experience of a child. Now, in over here in this case, we're using the term SWAT, a very hardworking student or a naughty child. I don't think I need to explain that. So, Padfield, for example, explores how informal reputations, such as being labeled as a SWAT or a naughty child, gained within school influence official definitions of students. Now, how is it that it is influencing official definitions of students? Now, for instance, if there's a child who has been labeled as a SWAT over here, does that mean tomorrow that child would be put into a higher band? If that particular child is going to be put into a higher band, how is it that his experience would be different, or how is it that her experience would be different from a child who was not put into a higher band and who was put into a lower band? And otherwise, so we're talking about informal labels being put by teachers. How is it that they're affecting a student's self-perception? Not only that, we're talking about how is it that it is eventually going to influence the definition, the official definition of students. Because of course, if there's a child from a top band, tomorrow when that child is progressing with his or her education, that particular child being from the higher band is definitely going to leave an impression on him and others around as well. I hope everyone gets this. Now, labeling theories examine how school processes shape meaning in terms of ideas such as the purpose of education. Now, when we talk about these labeling theories, what do these labeling theories show us? These labeling theories give us an idea about what the purpose of education system probably is, right? Now, to hint you guys, we could speak about Marxism over here, we could speak about feminism over here, we could speak about functionalism over here, right? What is the purpose of education? Is the purpose of education to sift and sort individuals so that you could come up with an amazing lot to do amazing jobs for the society to make it an amazing place? Functionalism. Or is the purpose of education to educate just enough individuals to take care of higher ranking or higher strata jobs, and the rest to be all members of workforce? Marxism again. Now, these labeling theories examine how school processes shape meanings in terms of ideas such as the purpose of education. Number two, the roles and relationships within schools. Number three, student self perception developed through processes such as streaming, banding, and setting. Many of you would have an idea about what streaming, banding, and setting is. For the ones who do not, we discussed this after a couple of slides when we'd be doing ability grouping. So, the purpose of education, the roles and relationships within school, and the student's self perception, the self perception that a student holds about himself or herself based on the stream they belong to, based on the band they've been put into. Right now, taking it ahead, labeling processes have two distinctive features over here. Let me highlight them. We speak in terms of cultural capital, and the second one is pretty much not highlighted, just put with a different color. So, labeling processes have two distinctive features over here. What sort of two distinctive features are we talking about? Number one, according to Bremy in 2005, suggests that they involve cultural capital. Now, remember, we've spoken about this cultural capital earlier, and we've spoken about this numerous times. What exactly is cultural capital? Cultural capital has to do with the non-economic benefits or advantages that a child from the middle and the upper class has, and based on those non-economic characteristics or experiences, how is it that it is makes it different for a child from the working class? So Brimi suggests that they involve cultural capital. A student's home and family background has a significant impact on their experience of education and how successfully or otherwise. Now the important point comes over here: how successfully or otherwise are they able to negotiate with that label? Now, for instance, if there's a child from the middle class or the upper class and the teacher puts up a label on him or her, is that child, or do you think that child is has or does know the ways to be able to negotiate with that label, or that particular child would simply take the label as is, as it comes to him or her, right? Or in other words, we could speak about the child from the working class. How is it that a child from the middle class compared to a child from the working class, how is it that they are in different positions when it comes to being able to negotiate the labels that have been put on them? Don't you think a child from the middle class probably is in a better position than if you compare it with a child from the working class? Probably yes, right? So how successful or otherwise they negotiate the various barriers to success, such as examinations or negative labeling. I hope we all get this. Yeah. So Brimi suggests that they involve cultural capital. A student's home and family background has a significant impact on their experience of education and how successfully or otherwise, I feel like highlighting this because I find this important. How successful or otherwise are they able to negotiate this label that has been put on them, right? How is it that it helps them or otherwise when it comes to getting through these hurdles, right? Number one. Number two, we speak about Nash. According to Nash suggested that success or failure in exam is not simply a matter of person's background or the or how wealthy their parents are. There are more subtle processes. Let's do this again. There are more subtle processes at work in the classroom, right? Now, what sort of subtle processes are we talking about? Are we talking about a child being able to manage his or her impression on others and the teacher as well? How do you think? I mean, does the social class the child belong to affect his or her ability to be able to leave an impression on other fellow pupils and the teacher, the admin? Question mark, right? So Nash suggested that success or failure in exams is not simply a matter of a person's background, right? Now this Nash over here is somewhat not getting along with what Brimi had to say, right? So Nash suggested that success or failure in exams is not simply a matter of person's background or how wealthy their parents are. There are more subtle processes at work in the classroom relating to how teachers and students manage their impression. It's expression written over here. Manage their impression of each other, right? What sort of an impression is the child from a working class able to leave on the teacher? What sort of an impression is a child from the middle class able to leave on the teacher? And how is that impression that they're able to leave on the teacher affecting their educational experience? For instance, student can employ if a student can employ enough cultural capital to conform to the teacher's perception of a good pupil, they may be able to overcome particular disadvantages in the home background. Now, what we're talking about is a child from a working class background, probably from who lacks cultural capital. If that particular child is able to or somewhat manages to overcome the disadvantages that he or she has from the home background he or she belongs to, would that make a difference when it comes to his or her educational experience? How is it now that we how is it that he would be able to overcome the disadvantage faced because of the cultural background or the cultural capital? It's it that child's ability to leave a good impression on the teacher. I hope we get this. We get this. Now, this explains why some students from disadvantaged social backgrounds succeed in education system. In other words, are we trying to imply over here that the children from the working class who end up do succeeding or who end up performing well in their examination, is it because that they were smart enough or they learned their way out, or is it that they learned how to overcome the particular disadvantages that they were facing during their educational experience by leaving a good impression on the teacher? Question mark. Right? Moving on. School processes such as streaming, setting, and banding are a significant source of positive and negative labeling. This is in itself an important part of the process of a student's self perception based on reference groups. Now, this is an important process. Now, what is this? This is this, and this is this, right? So, we're talking about streaming, setting, and banding. How is it that the band that you belong to affects your self-perception? Now, to put it in a simplistic manner, a child being referred by others and the teachers as an A grader, don't you think that is going to affect your self-perception? Don't you think that is going to affect what you think or feel about yourself? And on the other hand, if a child or a group of children, they've been labeled as students who are not serious, students who are backbenchers, maybe, don't you think this is going to affect that particular child's self perception? Now, the self perception that you hold, what you think about yourself or how you perceive yourself, is based on the reference groups. Reference groups are the groups that you compare yourself with, right? For instance, if I'm talking about an A grade student, an A grader, right? If I'm talking about, now the term in the last slide was SWOT, right? Or if I'm talking about nerds, don't you think that is, or let's not use the word nerds, if I'm talking about a child who's been referred to as studious by the rest, right? Don't you think that is going to affect that child's self-perception? Now, the self-perception, the student self-perception is based on reference groups. अब reference group हम किसे कहते हैं? The people we compare ourselves to in whatever role we are playing, right? Teachers are an important part of a student's Teachers are an important part of a student's reference group. Their opinions are always significant because they have the power to create and impose a label that relate directly to an individual's self-perception. Now, a child being referred to as the studious child by the others compared to a child being referred to as a studious and a hardworking and a bright child by the teacher would be different, right? Your friends might call you bright, but when the teacher out loud in class calls you a bright student, a hardworking student, a student who is likely to do really well in the examination and the future, that is going to leave an impact. Get it? So we're talking about the teachers holding an important position over here because they have the power to create and impose labels. They have the power to create and impose labels that relate directly to an individual's self perception. Teachers are not alone in this role. Teachers are not alone in this role. Along with this, your fellow pupils, they have their role to play as well. We spoke about teachers, now we're speaking about your fellow pupils. They're also part of the school reference group because, of course, you're comparing. See, the people we this, right? Fellow students are also part of the school reference group and may have a significant impact on how the role of education is defined through pro and anti school subcultures. Now, we discussed this after a bit. We're speaking about pro school subcultures, we're speaking about anti school subcultures, and the names pretty much explain them all, right? You know what a subculture is, and when I talk about an anti school subculture, it pretty evidently shows us or gives us an idea that we're talking about students who have formed a subculture, and that particular group doesn't really go by the rule book. They aren't probably serious. They would be involved into truancy. There'd be a lot of absenteeism. There'd be a lot of disciplinary issues. They would not follow the rules and regulations that the school sets. So, an anti school subculture and a pro school subculture is the opposite, right? So, the educational significance of teacher labeling is partly expressed in terms of self fulfilling prophecies. That is a nice one. Self fulfilling prophecy. What exactly is self fulfilling prophecy? Self fulfilling prophecy is a labeling theory, a prediction in this context, when we speak about the self fulfilling prophecy, the idea over here is that a label being put on the student, on a particular student by a teacher, in this context, right? Self fulfilling prophecy, a label that has been put on a student or a group of students by the teacher, and the impact that label has on him or her. Or in other words, if a teacher time and again keeps on calling a student a smart one, a bright one, a hardworking one, there are chances that that particular student might want to put in more efforts, right? And when that particular child is putting in more efforts, there are chances that that particular child might end up doing well in their examination, right? uh, to put it in a simple manner, a label being put on you, because of that label, how your self perception has changed about yourself. Self perception, so yeah, how your self perception has been affected, and how that has led to the amount of efforts you're putting. And a teacher doesn't really have to say that out loud, you know. If a teacher thinks a child is smart, the teacher might directly or otherwise somehow convey that message, intentionally or unintentionally. If a teacher feels a student is smart, that might be conveyed to him or her by mere classroom interaction, and that might eventually end up translating in terms of differences when it comes to educational attainment. Though we're speaking about this self-fulfilling prophecy, we talk about this in detail in the slides ahead. Oops. Here you go. So, the educational significance of teacher labeling is partly expressed in terms of self-fulfilling prophecy, a prediction about something such as ability that by being made causes it to occur. That's a nice way to put it. A prediction about something such as an ability of a student that by being made causes it to occur. In other words, you call a student a smart one, he or she puts in efforts and ended up showing that he or she is a smart one through examination results, or sadly otherwise. Now, I hope everyone has understood this. Let's take this a step further. I'd want everyone to read through this study that was conducted by Rosenthal and Jacobson. This is again not from your book. This is additional material, but I'd still want everyone to read through this first. And once you're done, then we proceed. Now, since we're done reading through this, I hope everyone has a better idea in terms of what self fulfilling prophecy is. How is it that the study that was conducted by Rosenthal and Jacobson showed, or the idea that they tried giving was that a label that was put on students, a random label that was put on students, eventually ended up reflecting, or eventually ended up affecting their educational attainment. Moving on, Nash studied how teachers' beliefs about good and bad students were transmitted to students through teachers' attitudes and behavior. The belief that a teacher holds about a student eventually transmitting to the students through the teacher's attitude and behavior towards him or her. Like I said, a teacher doesn't really have to say it out loud, right? Through your interaction, a teacher might unintentionally or otherwise leave an impression on a student that, see, I think you're smart, and because I think you're smart, you do well. You just need to put in efforts. So he concluded that teachers' expectations are a determining factor in a student's educational success or failure. According to Nash, teachers' expectations are a determining factor in a student's educational success or failure. Teachers made conscious and hidden or subconscious predictions about the ability of their students that affected the behavior of those students. Where they associated working class students with low levels of attainment, they reinforced this cultural stereotype through their lowered expectations. There you go. We were speaking about, or we still are speaking about, in school factors, and in other words, school experience of a student being affected because of the social class they belong to. In this case, we're speaking about pupils from the working class since teachers do not really, because of the stereotypical image that particular group carries, because the teachers aren't really expecting much from that particular group, they would have lower expectations from them. The idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy also applies for whole classes of students who may find themselves negatively labeled through practices such as streaming, setting, and banding. Of course, if a child knows that he or she is a part of a lower band and is being taught separately, how do you think, or what sort of impression do you think that child would have about himself or herself, right? So the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy also applies to whole classes of students who may find themselves negatively labeled through practices such as streaming, setting, and banding, or through processes such as the social class they belong to, the gender, or their ethnic stereotype. According to Nell Keddy, now I'd want everyone to read this later too. According to Nell Keddy, Keddy found that the academic label attached to a student followed them through their schooling and was a crucial influence on how they were thought of or perceived by new teachers. Now, if you're moving from primary to secondary, if you're moving from O levels to A levels, right? The label that has been put on you, the academic label that you carry with yourself, what sort of impression does that hold on a new teacher that you come across? Their behavior and ability were interpreted in the light of that label that brought to the classroom rather than simply assessed as something new. Now, a child who has been, I'll give you an example that is pretty relatable these days. A child who has passed an examination through a predicted grade, a teacher is always doubtful. The new teacher, for instance, from AS to A2, from O levels to A levels, the new teacher is always in a state of doubt, right? So while labeling is generally directed at individuals and groups, whole schools may also find themselves positively or negatively labeled. That is a nice one. Whole schools. Now, for instance, if there's a child who has graduated from Harvard, what do you think the image that child carries about himself because of the school they attended? Or a child, I mean, there are numerous schools in our city as well, I would not like naming any, positively or otherwise. The school you're doing A levels from, the college you're doing A levels from, or the school where you've done your primary from, it carries a label with itself. And people start giving you a 2 plus or a 2 minus based on the institution you have come from, right? In many countries, the most expensive private schools generally attract positive labels, while comprehensive schools, especially those in poor inner city areas, often attract negative labeling, right? I think that's pretty simple and understandable. Moving on, Givitz argues that the type of school attended can create a self fulfilling prophecy of success or failure even before a student enters the classroom. Top performing schools, whether private or state maintained, create a climate of expectation that pushes students into higher level of achievement. A major methodological problem with labeling explanations is that they're both a cause and a consequence. This is a nice one I'd want everyone to keep in mind over here. A major methodological problem while discussing all of this is it a cause or is it a consequence? Or in other words, let me explain this to you through an example here. Is it the way a child behaves or a particular social group behaves that they have been labeled in a particular manner? Or is the particular social group behaving in a particular manner because of the label that has been attached to them, right? A more desi way, जो लेबल आपने अटैच किया है किसी बच्चे के ऊपर या किसी सोशल ग्रुप के ऊपर, क्या बच्चे का बिहेवियर उसके क्या बच्चे के बिहेवियर के ऊपर उसका लेबल बेस्ड है या बच्चे के लेबल के ऊपर? हाँ, वेट, क्या बच्चे के बिहेवियर की वजह से आपने उसके ऊपर ये लेबल किया है? या ये भी हो सकता है, इट कुड बी इन दैट केस इट वुड बी अ कॉज, राइट? इट वुड बी अ कॉज व्हेन इट्स द बिहेवियर that has led to that label. Right now, in that case it makes sense, or is it, or it doesn't? That's a question for you all now. Or is it that label, because of that label, that particular group has started behaving in that particular manner? I don't know if you guys would understand this. They say bad se badnaam bura, right? So The badnaam is the label here, and because of that label, everyone, the perception that people start holding about you, बंदा किसी को पता है कि यार वो वैसे ही बदनाम है, तो बंदा कहता है यार मैं ऐसा बिहेव कर ही लेता हूँ अब, right? So a major methodological problem with labeling explanations is that they are both a cause and a consequence of differential achievement. This follows because for teachers to label working class boys as underachievers, they must already be aware of differences in educational achievement. Number two, if differential achievement causes teacher labeling, such labeling cannot be an initial cause of differential achievement, although it may afterwards contribute to it. So this is what I just said, right? Is it because of the behavior that has led to a label, or is it because of the label that has led to a particular behavior? Moving on towards the moving on and scrutinizing this, criticizing this, concepts such as labeling and self-fulfilling prophecies are too deterministic. Of course they are. Although if you have a closer look at this, if you think about this, it isn't necessary that a label that you put on someone would eventually going to the child would eventually going to behave or perform in that particular manner. By just calling someone an A grade student, it doesn't mean that particular child would end up getting an A grade student. Or by calling someone, by having lower expectations from someone, or by calling someone, by pushing someone towards lower bands, by calling someone a non serious, academically less able student, that doesn't at all determine his or her educational success or failure. Now, this is pretty clear through the study that was conducted by Margaret Fuller in 1984. This study shows us how a group of girls who didn't really have a very good impression on the teachers, what they did was they knew that the teachers didn't really have expectations from them, and what they did was they put in extra efforts to prove them wrong, maybe. या तो जरूरी नहीं है कि सेल्फ फुलफिलिंग प्रोफेसी आपकी हमेशा काम भी करती हो. इट इज टू डिटर्मिनिस्टिक ऑफ अ थ्योरी, राइट? और पुट इट इन सिंपल मैनर, ये भी हो सकता है कि एक बच्चे को आप बुरा बोलो तो वो बच्चा जोश खा के और ज्यादा एफर्ट्स पुट इन करके और आपको गलत प्रूफ कर दे, राइट? तो concepts such as labeling and self-fulfilling prophecies are also criticized for being too deterministic. As explanations for underachievement, they suggest general processes that once set in motion are almost impossible to reverse. Interactionists. Now, it isn't like this, right? They aren't always impossible to reverse. ये नहीं है कि बच्चा कोई आज जिसको आप अच्छा कह रहे हो तो पूरी जिंदगी अच्छा रहेगा, आप जिसको बुरा कह रहे हो तो पूरी जिंदगी बुरा रहेगा, या बुरा होगा भी, right? So interactionists see this as too deterministic. Students are able to contest labels. Now, what is this contesting labels? Refusing to internalize them. This can even lead to the opposite, a self-negating prophecy. There you go, right? For example, where a student who's labeled as not good at a subject reacts by working harder and proving that they can do well. So I hope everyone has understood this, and now we move on towards discussing ability grouping. While discussing ability grouping, we speak about streaming, banding, and setting. I'd want everyone to read through this once, and once you're done reading through this slide, we'd proceed. Now, let's proceed and speak about ability grouping over here. While discussing ability grouping, we talk about streaming, and then we'd speak about setting and then banding. This is setting, banding, and this is streaming. Now, what exactly is streaming? Many schools allocate students to classes according to their perceived ability. Streaming is also known as ability grouping. It's written down though. Ability grouping. Or, in other words, splitting year groups into several hierarchical groups that stay together for all lessons, right? Streaming was once very common in the UK, but increasingly not used in favor of setting and banding. In other words, streaming was very common in UK and it was then replaced by setting and banding. This involves allocating children to different year groups or streams within the school on the basis of their academic ability. How academically able you are, based on that, they put you into a separate class. The streams are ranked in a hierarchy, and students are normally tested at the end of each academic year and is assigned to the same or different streams. The evidence suggests that streaming not only has significant consequence for the individual student, but it can also reinforce educational inequalities and differential achievements. According to David Hargreaves in 1967, the study of Lumley School notes noted that boys were streamed on the basis of academic ability. After the first year at secondary school, it was also important for a boy allocated to the bottom stream to later move into the top stream. So, if at the beginning of the year a child has been put into a bottom stream, towards the end, it would get very difficult for a child to move up the stream. Or in other words, the stream that you have been allotted, it is something that goes with you. It is then a part of you, right? So, while Hargreave found a close correlation between social class and streaming, now uh, that is worthy of notice over here. According to David Hargreaves, Hargreaves found a close correlation between social class and streaming. In other words, are we talking about individuals from the middle and the upper class being put into higher streams, and the children from the working class being put into lower streams? Question mark. Right. So with the middle class children in the top and the working class in the bottom streams, he has also found that the experience of streaming made each child feel they were a success or a failure. A child who's been put into a lower stream might not really think high about himself or herself, might get demotivated, right? Might not want to put in more efforts. So the lack of movement between streams also encouraged the development of pupil subculture. Now that's again noticeworthy. Yeah, so the lack of movement that we have discussed from this part, the lack of movement between streams also encourage the development of pupil subcultures. Now we're talking about kids being categorized into the smart ones and the not so smart ones, which can definitely, or which does definitely has the chances of developing pupil subcultures based on the stream that they belong to. And there could be conflicts between them, right? There could be inter-stream conflicts, the smarter ones thinking too high of themselves, and the smarter ones in this case being put into higher streams, and the lower streams ones they retaliating against the system or against the counterparts from the higher streams. So the lack of movement between streams also encouraged the development of pupil subcultures. This led not only to conflicts between teachers and pupils, but also to inter-stream pupil to pupil conflicts, right? Moving on, let's have a look at what setting is and then what banding is. Now, what is setting? Now, setting is pupils are streamed on the subject by subject basis, right? For instance, subjects that are considered to be more important, students being students who are considered to be smarter being access to those subjects, and the students who are considered to be less academically able not being allowed access to those subjects, right? Banding are allocated banding. Pupils are allocated different bands when they enter secondary school on the basis of reports from teachers in the primary school. Based on the reports that you get from primary school, when you go to secondary school, you are allocated to different bands. There could be higher bands or lower bands. So the two common variations on streaming involve banding and setting. Setting in particular avoids some of the more social consequences of streaming. For example, it tends to avoid the development of strong subcultural relationship and groups. This, right? Hallam et al. Note that it has both benefit and drawbacks. Benefits include minimizing disruptive behavior. Of course, if you, the students who considered to be the naughty ones, the disruptive ones, if they are separated, that makes it easier for the academically able ones to be able to focus on their academics, right? So this is could be considered to be a benefit. Whereas when we speak about drawback includes stigmatizing, labeling, negatively stereotyping lower set pupils as academic failures, and the long-term association between lower sets and unemployment, higher sets and good exam grades. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Moving on, Nell Kelly teachers give more creative work and privileges to higher set students while restricting lower sets to tedious routine works. So we just spoke about what streaming is, what setting is, what banding is, and what sort of impact streaming, setting, and banding can have on the education progress of a child. Moving on, while streaming, setting, and banding are part of a social process that heightens or diminishes a child's expectation of educational success or failure, this is not the whole story. Associated with such practices are the attitudes, the perceptions, and beliefs that teachers have about children that are transmitted consciously or unconsciously through classroom interaction. Of course, if a child is teaching students from the higher stream or from the higher band, they would consciously or subconsciously have different attitude towards them, be holding different perception about them. The belief about those children would be very different for the teacher, right? And which might eventually, like I said, translate into classroom interaction, which would eventually affect the educational performance of the child, right? So Ketty argues this creates a situation where those in the top streams set or bands come to understand the nature and boundaries of what is to count as knowledge. It would seem to be the failure of high ability pupils to question what they are taught in schools that contribute in large measures to the educational achievement. Now, again, this is something that isn't really written over here, but I just explained this to you. According to Nell Getty, you know what? A higher band, a higher stream student is expected to not question the teacher. There are numerous amount of resources, the resource that a teacher is using to teach the students, it is expected from a top band, from a higher band student, from a top stream student to assume that's the best way they can be taught. And that eventually, that's more like a vicious cycle. The more faith the student shows in the teacher, the more acceptance he'd get or she'd get, which would lead to the teacher giving them the resources that are better than others. In other words, the teacher decides what's right, what's wrong, according to this. I'm not saying this according to Nell Kerry. Yeah. So the teacher decides what is suitable for who. Even when you talk about sociology, like I say, sociology subject is a subject that requires a lot of reading and writing. There are students who are asked to expected to cover the syllabus book, the syllabus content from the Cambridge Indoors book thoroughly, and then there are other students who are provided with additional information who once done from the books are advised to, they suggested they're advised other books. Teacher goes like, okay, now that you're done with this, go read this, you'd get extra information from here. Now another example over here, now these extra pieces of information that I've added over here, there's a reason behind them. They're from different books, they're not from this book. So I hope everyone gets this point that Nell Geddy was trying to put over here. We'd move on and we'd step into a new domain now, that is development of subcultures. When we speak about the development of subcultures, you know what, it would be it wouldn't be fair for us to simply call someone as a good student or not so good student, or it wouldn't really be appropriate for us to assume that there are only two type of subcultures that are there at school, that is pro school subculture and anti school subculture. This gentleman Peter Woods in 1976 came up with eight different modes of adaptation, or eight different type of subcultures ranging from ingratiationists to rebellions, and there's a lot in between. In order to understand them well, ingratiation or the teacher's pet, I don't think I need to explain that. Compliance, the children who there with the purpose, the purpose is to study and move out. And then we have opportunists, they keep on fluctuating with their friends, their amazing friends, with the teachers, their amazing students. Then we have ritualists who are just going through the motion. Then we have retreatists who they try to pass the time by daydreaming in lessons, mucking about or having laugh. Then we have colonizers, the ones who try to avoid trouble but will copy or cheat if required, and if they think they wouldn't get caught. Then we have intransigence. They are very indifferent to academic success. They reject the accepted standards of behavior. And then we have an extreme rebellions for whom school life is directed towards quite different objectives. I want everyone to read through this because this is going to give you a very good idea about what we are referring to over here. Now, when we speak about these student subcultures, another factor within schools that influences attainment by social class, ethnicity, and gender is the existence of schools student subculture. Groups of students who are opposed to the values of school or of education and society more generally attract the most attention. They dash with school authorities and This should be clash. Yeah, they clash with school authorities, and the behavior of attitudes associated with them are likely often combined with labeling and ability grouping to lead to low attainment. Other subcultures, however, may conform to the values of school and of education and society. So, in other words, in this paragraph, we were speaking about a pro-school subculture and anti-school subculture. And like I said, Peter Woods came up with eight more categories, no, six more categories, eight in total. So, Woods argues that there is a range of subcultural response or adaptation to school culture, with those who want to please, that is ingratiationists, at one extreme, the most positive adaptation that involves students who try to learn the favor of teachers and form a pro school subculture, and the rebels on the other extreme, those who explicitly reject the culture of the school and may even develop a counter school subculture. From this slide, what we need to keep in mind is the pupil subculture or the school subcultures that students belong to does affect their educational attainment. If you still don't get this, remember when your beloved mommy says, listen, you need to have good friends. This is partially what she means, right? When she, parents, they keep on asking the kids to have good friends. And that's because, like they say, a man is known by his company. The group of friends you hang out with or you are with at school, they eventually do end up affecting your educational experience and your educational attainment too. So, what Peter Woods is trying to say over here is that we shouldn't simply um, it shouldn't be very binary, it shouldn't be good or bad. There are a range of different adaptations that students follow. Taking this a step further, many subcultures involve class, ethnicity, and gender, so that it is not possible to easily separate these factors, right? Now, for instance, girls would be, there's a possibility that they might be spending more time with girls, forming a girl subculture, or they could be individuals from different ethnicities, South Asians forming a separate subculture for themselves, Afro Caribbeans forming separate subculture from themselves. So आपके पास subcultures इन basis इन चीज़ों के इन factors के basis पे इन factors के ऊपर भी बनते हैं, ठीक है? तो for example, the subcultural response in McIngale's 1996 study of the British school were a more subtle outcome of a complex interplay of class, race, and sexuality. Working class boys eagerly looked forward to leaving school at the earliest possible and entering paid work, but in reality, this type of work had all but disappeared, creating what McIngale called a crisis of masculinity. Now, this crisis of masculinity has been discussed by us in AS, and while doing education, we've discussed this earlier as well. Now, what McIngale is trying to explain over here is that working class boys, they are more eager to leave school at the earliest opportunity that they get, right? One, because probably they're not enjoying the school experience. Number two, they need to enter paid employment or paid work so that they can be a helping hand to the family, right? These boys, when they see that the jobs that they were looking forward towards being a part of, when they are, because of technological advancement, because of a high rise in service industry, those jobs are disappearing, which is leading to a lot of unemployment for these working class boys, and they do not really a very bright they do not really see a very bright future, which might result in a crisis of masculinity. They clung to an outdated mode of masculinity that was focused on traditional forms of manual wage labor that no longer existed. They frequently employed racist explanations such as the blacks have taken our jobs to explain and rationalize this situation. Now, what we need to keep in mind over here is there are other factors such as your social class, your ethnicity, your gender that end up affecting the school subculture you belong to as well. And then we have this reference from the study that was conducted by McElgate in the 1990s, and through that we have an idea, we do understand how your your social class, your gender, and your ethnicity can impact the school subculture that you are a part of. I hope everyone has understood this so far. I'd suggest you all to read through this as well. Now, we were speaking about these young boys from the working class and the subculture that McIngale claimed these boys were a part of. And in contrast, we would refer to these two groups of pro school young people, pro school, right? Over there, we are speaking about anti school. Number one, academic achievers. Number two, new enterprisers. Now we're talking about categories and then we're referring to subcategories. What does this explain us? From this we understand that it is not as simple as pro school or anti school. There are a range of other factors that play their part, and within these subcultures we have further categories too. So academic achievers with a strong school and work ethic who look to academic qualification as a route to social mobility, and new enterprisers who rejected the academic route to mobility and focused instead on developing practical skills, particularly in business and IT, that they hoped would be rewarding in the changing labor market, right? So I don't think this requires an explanation here. A number of studies have also found young people who are pro education but anti school. Now, listen to that one carefully. They're pro education but they're anti school. The ones who do not take the education system very seriously, but at the same time, they are very serious about their academics, right? They're the peoples who would not be apparently putting in a lot of efforts at school, but then eventually they are the ones who are probably sitting back home and putting in efforts, or they're seeking help from other sources. But for them, their academics is important, right? From them, school might not be important, their academics for them is. Though a number of studies have also found young people who are pro education but anti school. For example, McKengill identified what he called real Englishmen, a group of middle class students who aspired to university and the professional careers that were enjoyed by their parents. This group played an elaborate game of making fun of school values while at the same time simultaneously working hard mainly in private outside school. They believed that this was achieving success on their own terms, right? The ones who have fun at school, not the way they should. They try to reject school values, but at the same time, they are very serious about their academics, right? So, permanent exclusions from school influence educational performance as well. Now, if we're talking about a particular group, let's just say this one, and if there are statistics that reveal that children or the pupils from a particular social group are being excluded more, don't you think that would result in a bad impression about the system by the rest from the same group, from the same social group, right? So according to Hughes, and now we talking about this under the heading of permanent exclusion from school, right? According to Hughes and Church in 2010, there are currently 8,000 permanent exclusions from UK schools each year. The majority of excluded students are from the working class. Now, this wouldn't clearly leave a very good impression on other children, right, from the working class only. Around 5,000, around 50,000 students each day take unauthorized absence from school. The majority are from the working class, and these students are, according to Bab et al., highly likely to leave school with no qualification at all. So, this again can lead to, if a student from belongs to this particular social group, from this particular social class, probably is a part of a subculture, a school subculture, where they see their fellow classmates being excluded from school more than the rest. This would result in hatred according to the against the hatred according hatred against the system. They might feel like they're next. They might feel like if there's something wrong they do, they'd be excluded. Whereas if someone from another social group might be involved in that same mischief, let's just say, they might simply be warned, issued a warning letter, and that's it, right? So, this, I hope, has given everyone an idea about the role subcultures do play when it comes to affecting the educational attainment of pupils. Now, another tiny little thing that I would like to bring into everyone's attention is compensatory education program. What sort of compensation are we talking about, and how is it that this compensatory education programs run? We have a few examples over here, right at the bottom of this slide as well. You know what? Let's link this to where we started off from, and since this is the last slide too, we've spoken about numerous times we've spoken about how individuals from the middle and upper classes, they have a an advantage, a hidden advantage or a benefit when it comes to them going to school. Like I explain, there are students from the, according to many sociological commentators, there are students from the middle class. What happens is, because their because their home background complements their school environment, they are able to fit in well. And on the other hand, if we speak about individuals or pupils from the working class background, because their home background doesn't really or isn't really in line with the values of the school, they might experience a cultural clash. So, on one extreme, we're talking about cultural capital putting some students from a particular group to an advantage, and on the other hand, we're speaking about cultural deprivation playing its role. How individuals from some social groups, we're talking about the individuals from the working class, feeling systematically disadvantaged, the cultural deprivation theory. Or in other words, the experience, the exposure, the linguistic skills, the communication, the resources. Based on all of this, how a child from a working class feels deprived. Now, when a child feels deprived, or when a children from a particular social group feel deprived, you know what? I'm assuming you all know though do know the difference between equality and equity, right? For instance, if I let me make use of this space here. For instance, if I'm talking about someone from the working class being at this position and someone from the middle class being at this position, if they're both given resources, let's just say if the working class gets this much of resources and the middle class gets equal resources, they both do better. And in this case, we will say that the working class has improved, but guess what? This gap over here remains, right? In order to be able to compensate for this difference, what we could do is we could use positive discrimination. Or, in other words, positive discrimination. In other words, the individuals from the working class, how about we provide them with extra facilities, extra resources to be able to overcome this gap that is there between their educational performances as compared to the middle class students. So we're speaking about the concept of compensatory education programs being used over here. From this viewpoint of cultural deprivation theory, equality of opportunity could only become a reality by compensating for the deprivation and deficiencies of low income groups. If you want to talk about equality of opportunity, if you are looking forward towards being able to provide everyone with the same opportunity, you need to fill in this gap first. अगर आपके पास जब तक आपके पास ये गैप रहेगा, तब तक ये differences आपको तंग करते रहेंगे, तब तक आप दोनों बच्चों को, children from the middle class and the working class, you cannot put them together, right? This gap needs to finish first, and then you could work towards bringing in equality and or being able to provide equality of opportunity. And for this gap to finish, there are certain deprivations, certain deficiencies that the low income groups experience, और उन deficiencies, उन deprivations को overcome करने की बात कर रहे हैं हम यहाँ पे. Whew. From the viewpoint of cultural deprivation theory, equality of opportunity could only become a reality by compensating for the deprivation and deficiencies of low income groups. Only then would low income pupils have an equal chance to seize the opportunities freely provided for all members of society. From this kind of reasoning, developed the idea of positive discrimination. This is what I was talking about. Positive discrimination in favor of culturally deprived children. They must be given a helping hand to compete on equal terms with other children. This took the form of compensatory education. Though compensatory education programs have to do with extra facilities, resources being provided to individuals from lower income groups, or yeah, individuals from income groups, so that the problems that they have faced so far can be compensated, right? Being providing an helping hand to them. Now, additional, what exactly are these compensatory education programs? This is additional education provision for the culturally deprived. Since, according to many educational psychologists, most of the damage was done during primary socialization when a substandard culture was internalized in an environment largely devoid of richness and stimulation. Compensatory education could concentrate on the preschool years. Now, according to them, very conveniently blame educational psychologists for them. Since, according to many educational psychologists, the major damage over here in terms of major damage is done during the early years of a child's education. So the idea is to concentrate on preschool years and to provide compensatory education, or through the concept of positive discrimination, be able to favor children from lower income groups or from the working class. Compensatory ideas about cultural deprivation are focused on ways of compensating working class children for their broken dysfunctional family life, to give them an equal opportunity to compete with their culturally advantaged middle class groups. Now, in the UK, there have been a few examples. Let's read through these examples. We have the EAZ. EAZ is Education Action Zone. What exactly is EAZ? EAZ involves groups of primary and secondary schools joining forces with parents, councils, and local businesses to improve educational services. Groups of primary and secondary schools joining forces together along with parents, the councils, and local businesses to improve educational services in deprived areas. Number two, we'd speak about the Show Start scheme. What exactly is this Show Start scheme? This is again an example of compensatory education program. This was introduced in 2000. This was designed to improve services to the poorest preschool children and families to prevent truancy. What is truancy? This is when a child doesn't attend school without any reason, absenteeism, right? Which is not allowed, right? So, Sure Start programs were introduced in 2000. They were designed to improve services to the poorest preschool children and families to prevent truancy and increase achievement. Additional schemes were aimed at, at pregnant teenagers to help them back to education or training. I hope we get this. Number three, we speak about extended schools. Remember, one, two, and three, they're all examples of compensatory education programs over here, right? When we speak about extended schools, they offer services such as nurseries, support for parents, and leisure opportunities for students outside the school timetable, right? We're talking about providing services beyond school timetable, right? Arranging for nurseries, designed to engage parents in the child's education. The more engaged a parent is in the child's education, the more they'd be keeping a track, and the more they're keeping a track, the chances are that the child's education would improve or would get better. According to Wilkins et al., for example, yeah, I'm exhausted. According to Wilkins et al., they found a positive impact on lower class attainment, attendance, and behavior when schools offered activities that increased engagement and motivation for parents. So we have a reference over here in support of this as well. We had started off with the interactionist perspective over here. We had started off with in school factors, and this is where we the last thing that we spoke about over here is compensatory education. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. So yeah, what I was saying is we started off with in school factors, and we linked in school factors with social class, since we were studying social class in the last class, and social class playing its role in terms of determining the educational attainment of a pupil. Today we added up how your in school factors, the experiences within school, can actually affect the educational attainment as well. While discussing this, we spoke about concepts such as labeling, we spoke about streaming, we spoke about setting, we spoke about bands and banding. And then we moved on towards pupil subcultures, and we spoke about how pro and anti school subculture weren't the only subcultures. And if you remember, we spoke about Peter Woods. Peter Woods came up with eight different categories through which that he thought pupils adapt to. And after we were done discussing pupil subcultures, we spoke about compensatory education. This is pretty much it. And if no one has any further questions, I'd like to wrap it up over here. Stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected. Stay humble, spread positivity, spread smiles, and Allah Hafiz.
Love.
Allah Hafiz.